Andrew, welcome to the mother of all talk shows. In my opening remarks, I said that I didn't believe a word that the American deep state had to say because I've been there before. Once bitten, twice shy, and all of that. Was I being too harsh?
Well, I want to thank you for bringing me on the show. In my personal assessment, the United States deep state cannot be trusted. They have a track record of being very unreliable, outright lying, and manipulating the facts. As we're speaking about U.S.-Russian relations, and specifically the very tense situation in eastern Ukraine, we need to remember what the local Donbas militia leaders have said. They've been consistently warning that there could be a false flag attack. Now, obviously, that's not going to be by the Russian Federation. According to them, it would be staged by Kiev or Kiev's U.S.-led Western intelligence agency allies. So I believe that the situation is actually just as bad as you said, that you were definitely not too harsh on them. You actually had a pretty realistic assessment because the situation is tense and is very serious. I think everyone has the right to be very concerned.
Well, I've said from the beginning, Andrew, that Russia will not invade Ukraine, but Ukraine might invade those areas of eastern Ukraine populated overwhelmingly by Russian people, many of them Russian citizens, in absolute breach of the Minsk agreement, which they signed, that these areas could have autonomous status within Ukraine. Are there signs that that might be happening?
Yes, we do see those signs. According to both Russia and the Donbas militias, Ukraine has assembled over 100,000 forces across the line of contact, and there has been an uptick in shelling. What's very
funny,
worrying—
I never read that, Andrew. I keep reading about 100,000 Russians massed in Russia, but I've never heard the figure 100,000 Ukrainian forces on the line of division inside Ukraine.
Yes, and one of the reasons why this is so concerning is because Russian intelligence has warned that if Kiev is encouraged by its U.S.-led Western patrons to initiate a third round of civil war hostilities in Donbas, this wouldn't just be a humanitarian disaster, and it would also be a military one, of course, but it could serve as the pretext for the United States to deploy strike missiles to the region. And Russian intelligence is also very concerned that these might potentially be hypersonic missiles. Now, because the risk is assessed as very credible, that's why President Putin made the decision to publicize Russia's security guarantee proposals at the end of December. And these proposals have thus far served as the basis of Russian-American and Russian-NATO diplomacy over the past 6 weeks or so. So I believe, to answer your question, could there be some type of attack? I believe that there are forces in the United States, the American deep state, and to clarify what I mean by that, I refer to the deep state as America's permanent military, intelligence, and diplomatic bureaucracies, and there are different policy-making factions within there. In particular, the anti-Russian deep state faction in the United States has an interest in provoking the scenario, not only so that they can have their enemy number one, so to speak, for NATO to rally around. Granted, that's not working so well. I mean, some NATO countries are not on board with this. We see the German example, for instance. But they also hope that by doing this, the United States' so-called pivot to Asia to more aggressively contain China can be stopped and redirected back towards Russia. So you kind of have these two factions, the anti-Russian and the anti-Chinese deep state factions vying over which of these two great powers should they prioritize containing. Donald Trump wanted to focus on China, but now, and Biden seemed like he wanted to focus on China too, up until the past few months when this anti-Russian faction seemed to have been back up to their old tricks. And we see the situation now is very serious. Russian intel is very concerned. President Putin is directly involved. We have this high-level negotiations, and that's presently the state of affairs right now.
Let me walk that back. I can understand at least two reasons why the United States confrontation with China could be acute. One is that the Chinese political economic system is a competitor, a contender for the way forward for the world. It's a communist country ruled by a communist government. And therefore, you could say it's It's an existential threat to the American way. But Russia is a capitalist, European, white, Christian country. Why would that be enemy number one for the United States? I just don't get that, Andrew.
Okay, so I've actually been putting a lot of thought into that as well over the past few years. And my conclusion is that it's precisely because despite the cultural and socioeconomic and historical commonalities with Russia, Russia still maintains its sovereignty. Russia is very fiercely independent. And under President Putin's tenure, I mean, he's been in office for over 20 years now, in one capacity or another. Russia has really risen from its knees. And Russia has made sure that it's able to defend its interests. And I'm not just speaking broadly about interests here. I'm talking about socioculturally. They're very much against hyper-liberal values being imposed upon a traditionally majority conservative traditional population. Despite being involved in the Western type of capitalist system, they still want to preserve national sovereignty. They don't want transnational corporations dictating policy, taking control of strategic resources. And pretty much what we see is Russia sets an example that I believe the U.S. is concerned that other countries that are also culturally and historically similar in Europe, they might feel emboldened by this. They might feel like they want to flex their own national sovereignty. And quite curiously, we're not going to have enough time to go down this rabbit hole here. Poland is, in a way, in its own way, kind of following in Russia's footsteps. Granted, they are anti-Russian to the core when it comes to regional policies, but the ruling Law and Justice Party, which is comprised of nationalist conservatives, they have been, in their own way, trying to advance what the ruling party understands to be Poland's national domestic interest. And to that end, they have been undertaking a broad range of reforms, specifically in the judicial sphere and the media sphere. Granted, they will never say they're influenced by Russia, and they're obviously doing this independently on their own. But I do think it's very interesting that you have two countries that are at odds, but domestically, although it's an imperfect comparison, you already see this effect of Russia having been the last bastion of national sovereignty on the continent for the most part, having some different peers. You also have Hungary, of course, but I find the Polish example particularly interesting because most people wouldn't think of Poland as, under its current leadership, as flexing national sovereignty credentials and everything, but that's precisely what we have right now. Of course, again, we don't really have the time to go into it, but I encourage the audience to kind of do their own research and try to do some comparisons between the two. I find the comparisons to be quite interesting.
Well, of course, it isn't just Poland and Hungary. Bulgaria has opted out, basically, of Biden's response to the Ukraine crisis. Slovakia, at least in the form of its president, did. And now the president of the Czech Republic has done the same thing. And most importantly, as you alluded earlier, Germany is very definitely not on board. And even France is making independent noises about the need for a European security architecture, which is not prey to these madcap decisions from Washington. But as you say, we don't have unlimited time. So let me pivot to Asia. One of the consequences of this duality of confronting Russia and China at the same time is to ensure that Russia and China are almost now one. Economically speaking, I think increasingly militarily also, certainly diplomatically. Their geopolitical worldview is the same. The Chinese president said this week, in the company of Putin, we are not allies, we are much more than allies. This is the law of unintended consequences, isn't it, for American policy?
Yeah, I would go as far as saying that when the United States attempted to simultaneously contain Russia and China around 2014, we saw what happened with Euromaidan in Ukraine, and that's around the time the U.S. stepped up its provocations in the South China Sea. That unintended consequence, as you rightly put it, only pushed those two together. Granted, their grand strategies were already converging, but the United States' unprovoked aggressions against both served to accelerate that process. And with reference to President Putin's latest trip to Beijing, that really was globally game-changing because now everybody sees that their grand strategies are fully aligned. They are definitely working together with one another to synchronize the Russian-led Eurasian Economic Union and the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. This is going to unlock Eurasia's entire economic potential. We also see a lot of other world leaders were also in Beijing, and they're meeting with President Xi and other Chinese dignitaries. So what we're left with is the conclusion that with the United States, first of all, it should not have even tried to contain anybody. The United States should have tried to truly work with these countries and find a way to peacefully coexist and mutually benefit, in particular through economic, financial, and technological cooperation, ecological cooperation, and other manners in order to facilitate the irreversible emerging multipolar world order. But because they bit off more than they can chew, I mean, they shouldn't have even tried to concentrate on only one country, but by trying to concentrate on both great powers, which they pretty much serve as the dual engines of this emerging multipolar world order, all they did was accelerate the same process they wanted to indefinitely stop. And it seemed like under Trump, the American deep state concluded that they're going to focus on China. Biden seemed to kind of pick up the baton for almost, I'd say, about first 9 to 10 months of his presidency. But now the U.S. is trying to redirect back towards Russia. And this deep state is very confused. And we see that. I mean, Europe sees that. Asia sees that. India used to be regarded as on board with anti-Chinese containment plans. Nobody can any longer make that as an objective assessment. India actually hosted President Putin in early December, and they signed a 99-paragraph strategic partnership declaration to reaffirm their existing strategic partnership. So that whole Indo-Pacific policy of containing China through the Quad, it's not working. That's why they want to replace it with AUKUS. So what we're seeing is they're narrowing down these American-led military alliances. And you had mentioned the European front. And as we see, I mean, NATO itself is fractured. In the Asia-Pacific, the American-led alliance system, it's not working as the United States intended. The United States is confused. Nobody can rely on it. We saw what happened in Afghanistan. It was a very shameful evacuation. I mean, nobody expected a country that declares itself a unipolar hegemon to be defeated like that and so swiftly by the Taliban. I think right now America is experiencing a crisis of confidence. It's unsure of what it wants to do, and the whole world sees that. But because it's so confused, it's also trying to destabilize the world, trying to create a so-called scorched earth policy out of desperation, hoping that it can find opportunities in the chaos. And that's why this current Ukrainian crisis, which is really a U.S.-Russian missile crisis, is very, very dangerous.
Dangerous indeed. Finally, Andrew, what should we conclude from all of this? Is America run by idiots?
Okay, well, what I think that these people, each faction is very clever in their own way. They're very pernicious and they're very cunning. But the problem in the American system is because these two factions, anti-Chinese and anti-Russian, granted, the two factions themselves are the problem, but accepting that they're unlikely to ever disappear anytime soon, the very fact that they're so fiercely competing with one another is creating a lot of chaos. I mean, you use the word unintended consequences, and we see these unintended consequences aren't just globally on the geostrategic level. They're also domestically in the United States. The U.S. Anti-Russian deep state war against former President Trump totally destabilized the United States. I mean, we saw a couple of years ago the unrest that, in my personal assessment, was encouraged by Democrats for political self-serving reasons ahead of the 2020 elections with Antifa and Black Lives Matter. That wasn't just a color revolution. That was a spree of urban terrorism. That was actually, in its own way, a hybrid war on America by Americans in some ways. And we see that, are they idiots? Are they super geniuses? Well, they think they're the smartest guys in the room. They aren't. Are they idiots? Well, there's a lot of idiots among them. But I'm more concerned about the devious ones that are really trying to divide, rule, and destroy because they're so desperate, not only to cling to power, but they delusionally, in my view, think they can expand their power, not only abroad, but also at home. With America divided and U.S. is foreign policy divided. It's very unclear what's going to happen, but I'm cautiously optimistic that this Russian-Chinese entente will serve as a stabilizing force in Eurasian and global affairs, and that what just recently happened over the past few months, Putin in India, Putin in China, this is a game changer. Rick, Russia, India, China, if they can work out some of their differences, and there are some trade and border differences between India and China, I'm confident that we will actually live and see this emerging multipolar world order. I mean, it's developing in front of our eyes, but it's moving faster than ever. And that's precisely because of the law of unintended consequences and masterful leadership by President Xi and President Putin.
Andrew, I'm sure I'm not alone in the audience in thinking you to be an exceedingly clever young man and astoundingly eloquent to boot. How do people follow your work?
You could follow me on Twitter. My handle is @Korypko, K-O-R-Y-B as in boy, K-O. They could follow me on Twitter. I'm on Facebook, and I'm also on Telegram and the Russian social media site vk.com.
Fantastic. I really hope that we get to speak together again and before long. Thanks very much, Andrew, for coming on the show.